Tommy asks a very interesting question here, and for those who have been paying attention, and Tommy, I'm sorry, I'm going to let the cat out of the bag, but no, that's my habit. that's my indulgence, and you'll all put up with it. So I suppose you must at least expect it of me, if and on some degree enjoy it. Tommy is always asking very interesting questions. Whether posing puzzlers like this or engaging in the Michigassen back and forth that is very often YouTube, or setting fire to mannequins. Tommy is, in everything he does, asking profoundly interesting questions. And I'm sorry for uncloaking that, if that was intended to remain cloaked. But I think everyone who has the wherewithal to notice that probably has. But this interesting question. I've been sitting back on this one and looking at some of the responses to kind of figure out, well, what was actually necessary to say. The question, in essence, is, would one be willing to kill half the human race in order to, and this is the key word, preserve the species as a whole? And I think that that word preserve, which was not actually posed by Tommy, I think he left that very intentionally unaddressed. He did not use that word, and I think for good reason. That word preserve is somewhat spurious. That word preserve is kind of the heart of the question, at least to my way of thinking. Would one be preserving the human race? Or would one rather be altering the human race, the course of its history, the shape of individual identity, so radically that one could not even really consider it preservation? To me, it looks like what's really being proposed here is not a horrible decision wherein one would preserve humanity by making this horrible decision, but rather viewing the end of a species, the end of a history approaching. Human history, as it continues, as it has been, is coming to an end. Is one willing to cut it off right then and there, at that instant, at that moment, and for the promise of a different species, for the promise of a different history? And would that history, would that new history, would that new species be worthy of that severance, that euthanasia? What Tommy is describing is human history as a terminal patient, and putting us in the position of the physician and asking us, given the promise of, given a unique set of circumstances where one can kill a patient and get a newborn. But even there, the metaphor somewhat fails us, because we're not even we would not necessarily know a newborn what. Maybe I should clarify what I mean by this radical change that would occur. Very hyper-personalizing this. There's been some discussion of late On Stickum, which, by the way, if you're not there, you're missing out, because lots of interesting things occur there. There's been a conversation on Stickum regarding pacifism, wherein people were, essentially posing the question, are you a pacifist or are you not? And many differing degrees of answer. Because really, the question of pacifism comes down to how far are you willing to go before you would resort to violence. Many a person will say, I am a pacifist. Well, what about this situation? Well, in that case, I would have no choice. Or, I am a pacifist until all violence is the final solution. It's the last thing that should be tried. But the bitch of that question is, what do you consider the last thing you would try? Because I've met many a pacifist who will, if put to the test, who would say, well, yes, I mean, violence is the last resort. Well, I tried talking to them politely, and that didn't work, so obviously I've exhausted my options. An interesting litmus test that I've been kicking around, that was introduced to me by somebody else, kudos, Peaceful Ape, the question being, if a loved one, if you have a loved one who is being threatened, and you know that if you do not intervene, they will be raped, robbed, murdered, what have you. What do you do? What would you do in that situation? And the way that I addressed that, the way that I approached that, was saying I would stand in their way. Simply stand in their way. A way that I've addressed the pacifism question in the past is essentially, you're not a pacifist unless you're willing to take a beating. And you don't know that you're a pacifist until you have. Knowing full well that you had the power, that you have the ability to not take a beating, that you have the ability to wreak the necessary physical harm to incapacitate the individual who is trying to inflict violence upon you, and thus not take a beating, but deciding to take the beating anyway. That's kind of my criteria for that definition, my criteria for use of the self-identifier pacifist. But even that poses some interesting ethical questions and some interesting ethical problems, and ones that apply directly to the question that Tommy is asking here. Am I willing to set ethics, my ethics, as higher priority than the physical well-being of another? I believe that violence is wrong, period. But am I willing to state that my adherence to that is worth the suffering that could have been prevented were I willing to do violence? And that's, in essence,